Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. This is part 2 of a summary and book analysis of Practical Anarchy, The Freedom of the Future by Stefan Molyneux. He asks, which sector does more to protect you and your property, the public or the private? Let's look at the security mechanisms the private sector has introduced in just the past few decades. ATMs, credit cards, less need to carry cash. Cell phones can always call for help. Call display virtually eliminates harassing phone calls. Sophisticated home security systems like Nest Doorbell, ID tracking tags, credit card numeric security. Now you can get a notification on your cell phone when your credit card is used in an way that doesn't match previous patterns. Pepper spray, not to mention guns and tasers. Global positioning systems, security cameras, anti-shoplifting devices that make large sounds, decrease the likelihood someone thinks they could get away with stealing, secure online transactions, Yelp reviews, etc. What has the public sector done? Well, they shoot harmless drug users and seize their property. They will shoot you too if you don't pay the massive tax increases they demand. Any man who comes up to you and says, I need to threaten you, your person, and steal your property in order to protect your person and property is obviously either deranged or not particularly interested, to say the least, in protecting your person and property. Molyneux continues, saying there are 6 questions we should have in the back of our minds when discussing the philosophy of statism. 1, does government actually solve the problem in question? So in other words, we need to be protected. That's what government does. Does government really protect people? If I come up with examples of people not being protected and the government not caring, or the government creating the thing we need to be protected from, will you withdraw the statement? We need government to educate people for 12 years at a time, 6 hours a day. Well, are people educated in philosophy, history, foreign languages, morality, critical thinking? Question number 2, can the criticism of the anarchic solution be equally applied to the statist solution? But if we lived in a voluntary society, judges could be corrupt. Could there not be corrupt judges when a government exists? Actually, corruption's more likely to exist because they don't have the built-in mechanism of people being able to opt out of them if customers are unhappy with the service. But what if there's a private security force and they just, don't want to protect you? Yes, that could absolutely happen. That is why it's important we have the ability to opt out of funding them. With government, not only has that happened, that could happen, of course, and what they're going to do is increase the amount that they fund themselves because they'll say, well, this is because we just don't have enough funding and resources. Question number 3, is anarchy accepted as a core value in non-political spheres? In other words, when a statist is saying, the state needs to regulate A, B, and C. Well, shouldn't they really keep an eye on the ideas that you discuss and the books that you read? Because, ideas have to be the number one killer that have ever existed between communism, fascism, colonialism, just the idea that you have the right to own other people. Those ideas are so dangerous. If we don't regulate those ideas, bad ideas will arise and terrible things will happen. Therefore, the state gets to regulate ideas. Question number 4, would the person advocating statism perform the state function himself? In other words, I'm so confident that the $1 trillion annually that the state steals is done so efficiently and is so necessary for society to continue, I have the right to also steal money and shoot people who resist me in order to chip in for this welfare state. Question number 5, can something be both voluntary and coercive at the same time? In other words, if we are voluntarily part of this union, then we should have the option to opt out, to which they say, you are part of it voluntarily. That's what the social contract is. So I can opt out? No, you can't. Just asking the question at the heart of statism, secession, and the social contract proves that there is an inherent contradiction in all statist thought. Question number 6, does political organization change human nature? So let's say you believe human nature is bad. How does the existence of a state stop that from being a bad thing? What species do you want occupying the government? Human nature is good. Okay, well then we don't need a state. Human nature is mostly good, but some bad. Okay, the bad people, as we've obviously seen with Mao, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, are going to rise to the top because they're attracted to positions that violently dominate others. So under no circumstance is, well, human nature exists in such a way that a state is currently necessary, maybe in the future. Well, anything you apply to the existence of anarchism would also have to apply to the existence of a state. Molyneux discusses, what about the roads? This is actually a much more important question, I think, than it's often dismissed as. A great amount of research has been done in the privatization of roads and highways by Walter Block. And just getting in the way of thinking that there is one way to do things, and that's where we have pavement and traffic lights, that stops us from innovating and having things like the invention of these roundabouts created as an alternative. There is much less incentive to innovate when something is coercively funded and competition and voluntary funding is not incentivized in these sectors. Molyneux says, well, I'm not a psychic, but if I had to guess, when billions of people are acting voluntarily, roads would be built by housing developers, mall builders, town construction, tolls, GoFundMes, incentives for safety and efficiency will, there's an incentive for things to be more safe and efficient if you have voluntarily funded things as opposed to something you can't opt out of. 1 million people died in car crashes this year. All right, what are you going to do, not fund the state? Of course not. Global positioning systems and taxi measurement systems. So just as a toll increases when you're in a taxi, or it used to be when they were first making cell phones, every minute you spent on the phone cost you money, and then every text you sent cost you money, and then after there had been so much competition, free exchange, and innovation, well, now it's just you buy these full access plans. Same thing's going to happen with roads. There's also a road printing machine that is being invented that just shoots blocks out. So when the cost of something is drastically lower, the likelihood increases that people will fund it without there being too much concern of a free rider problem. Of course, the existence of a state does not solve the free rider problem. Molyneux makes the point, if we do not think human beings can organize themselves to take care of a few hundred meters of roads that they directly benefit from, then they will never be able to vote for political candidates with any thought for the common good, and democracy must be abolished. So the idea that, people are so stupid and they're so lazy that we're not going to have roads, that you're going to be over there and I'm going to be over here, and we'll say, I want to get to you, and you'll say, you want to get to me, but there's not a state to melt tar and lay it down, so we're just going to end up dying. Well, oh my gosh, if that's really how human beings are, we need to make sure there's not a system where they could vote and impose their will on millions of strangers. If you really think that's how people are, or maybe you're just being a manipulative psycho engaged in cognitive dissidence, trying to do anything to hallucinate a justification for why we need a state. Hans Moderman was a Dutch road traffic engineer and innovator. He was recognized for radically challenging the criteria used to evaluate engineering solutions for street design. This is the kind of thing we'll get much more of in a voluntarily funded society. His work compelled transportation planners and highway engineers to look afresh at the way people and technology relate to each other. Molyneux gets into the philosophy of DROs, or dispute resolution organizations. Far from being something that just exists in his head, these are things that have absolutely existed historically. They haven't been called this term necessarily, but they are organizations where people attempt to resolve disputes they have with other parties, such as the American Arbitration Association. You have tons of examples in a collection of essays written on the topic by Edward Stringham in Anarchy and the Law. The Structure of Liberty by Randy Barnett gets into them. The Last Half of the Problem of Political Authority by Michael Huemer. David Friedman in The Machinery of Freedom discusses it. Private Governance by Edward Stringham goes into actual historical examples of private law. So that's where you can go read about technicalities and then bring them to the mind of the statist, to which they'll say, that was then, this is now, that none of that counts. But haha, I made you do all that work, and it stopped you from engaging in conversation because you had to hurdle that nonsense. So instead, what you can say is, look, I just believe voluntary funded competition is superior morally and economically to coercively funded monopoly. So anything you could say about what if there's a court and they just allow rape, slavery, murder, and theft? Yes, that could happen because people could have interest, people could be dumb, people could be evil. But that could also happen when a state exists. The existence of a state does not stop bad things from happening. To the contrary, it incentivizes evil people to seek those positions of power, which they don't need consent to operate in. Such a system of DROs would have incentives to create consumer demand. You would have courts enforcing contracts or insurance companies. You would have, just like you have credit ratings today, Court X has this rating from this organization. Or what if the regulation agency is corrupt too? Yeah, that could happen. What species runs the FDA? Oh, people who are likely to engage in the same corruption? Okay, how about the EPA or OSHA? Of course, this always applies. In the same way people are members of gyms, they would be members of court systems, just as people have many different organizations that they have credit with. You could also have many different organizations that you engage in dispute resolutions with, just as car insurance companies have agreements with other car insurance companies. Private courts would have every incentive in the world to make sure they're cooperating with one another. So, if we all belong to the same court system, that's the only way it could work, because what if A and B get in a dispute? Well, then they just go to war and murder each other. Well, first of all, governments go to war and murder each other, so the existence of a government doesn't justify a monopoly on the court system. But also, we have things like emails. What if you have Gmail and someone else has Proton Mail and a third person has Yahoo? Well, those organizations are going to cooperate to make sure that that their customers are able to communicate and use it across company lines, because there's an incentive. Or remotes for televisions that also control TVs from different companies, that also control receiver boxes from different cable companies. Or phones. You are able to call someone on Sprint if you have Verizon or T-Mobile or AT&T. It's the equivalent of what Roderick T. Long says. You could make an Octagon credit card. There is no law, as far as I know, stopping you, but you wouldn't, because you, as a market innovator, have every incentive to make sure that the customers you're selling to have the ability to use it in such a way that is desirable and gives them a lot of choices in the exchange market. So in the same way, what if I have a court that charges $1 trillion and mandates slavery? Okay, yeah, it's the same thing as an Octagon credit card. What if I want to just start my own language? Sure, give it a shot. I don't think it's going to work out. Just like these rogue private security forces that people talk about, or these rogue businesses, they'll be very short-lived if they exist at all. Like cell phone companies, they only succeed if they cooperate. Applies with the dispute resolution organization. Molyneux continues by saying, look at the real-world examples of anarchy. Understand the word. No person or group of persons has the right to rule another. By rule, we mean claim a higher ownership over their body than the actual person. In other words, think of examples in the world where you act with other people without anyone initiating violence. Some of the most important decisions: who to marry, whether to have no kids, 1 kid, 10 kids, what books to read, what to believe in, who to spend your time with, what things to purchase, what career to have. Hey, before you get a career, I'm going to give you a list of what you can and can't spend your time on. This is too risky. This isn't worth your time. This is too dangerous. This is just not beneficial and a waste of resources, so you can't do them. Anytime the average person or non-governmental group does something like this, we see it as crazy, obvious tyranny and someone who's possibly a control freak and a psychopath. It's no different. Imagine saying men should be able to regulate women because women would live in a chaotic world without men regulating them. Whoa. Who's to say men are these terrific people who know exactly what's right? It's no different than saying a different group of people, the government, should regulate us. Who's to say that they know what to regulate, even if they were so brilliant, smart, and moral? They don't have the right to do so. And yes, most important things in the world, ideas, of course, should not be regulated by the state. Education for the poor. Molyneux again goes back into the idea of let's teach people how to think about things, not here's what they need to memorize in order to know how to make a statist retreat in his argumentation, but instead just understand the concept of since everyone is concerned about X, in this case, X could be schools or roads or the poor or having healthy things to eat. X will naturally be provided by those who are concerned by its absence. And even if people aren't concerned about schools, well, then we can't have a government because they'll just vote away schools. The Khan Academy is an example of something to which there is no monetary cost, and it's online. Another thing is Montessori. It's not free, but it is an example of voluntary education. But then again, nothing is free when you have to chip in through property taxes or we'll put you in a cage. Give me $1,000 a year and I'll produce YouTube videos, I'll cage you, and they'll be free. That is literally what the state is saying when they say free education. So this meme is intended to, of course, mock statists that, hey, we got free education too. Well, nothing's free. Khan Academy, it costs you thousands of hours to educate yourself on topics. You have to have an internet connection. Just as school isn't free, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as the old saying goes. The Khan Academy, that's free. They don't charge you. Hundreds of MOOCs, massive open online courses. Those are free. MITx, that's the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, free courses online. Princeton has the same thing. Harvard has the same thing on their YouTube channels. Yale also has a big one on philosophy. All these free or low-cost options. Wikipedia, no entry cost there. Mises.org, best thing on the planet. That is free. Tons of free PDFs. YouTube, not to mention BitChute. Google Scholar or the PDF search engine. So yeah, there's tons of these low-cost, no monetary necessary ways of educating yourself. So just because you desire something to exist doesn't mean the state, first of all, is morally justified in its monopoly on violence, and second, doesn't mean it's the most efficient way to achieve that thing. He goes into something that people will often say right after they lose the philosophical discussion. They go, hey, come on. You and I, we are smart, moral people. That's why we're having this intellectual conversation. The average person, though, is very dumb, and that's why we need a government to kind of, we need someone to rule over everyone just to engage in noble lies and make sure everything goes smoothly. So, hold on. These people are so dumb that they need to be constantly regulated and forced to attend schools and have this forced sex education. But you also believe in democracy or a republic? So these are the same people that should be voting. It is literally what Don Boudreaux calls dumb individuals, brilliant moral citizens. Everyone is an idiot except once every 2, 4, and 6 years on election day. Then they're brilliant. Then people should decide who to elect to control our environment, our healthcare, our education, our foreign policy, our domestic policy, our drug policy. That's how brilliant people are. They know who to elect to bring these things into fruition. Molyneux says, if evil people exist in society, they will also exist within a state and be far more dangerous thereby. In other words, look at Donald Trump. Pretty dangerous guy when he was, opting out of contracts that he had made promises to pay, according to some research in his personal business. And look, as bad as those things are, he wasn't able to engage in mass murder and get people to cheer for him like he is now when there's a government. This concept completely throws leftism on its head. We need government to protect us from the private sector. Noam Chomsky says, the government is the one institution that you can change in society. Private, when things are private, that's when they're tyrannical. Government can be good or bad. And of course, the exact opposite is true. Bad person Trump exists. Would you rather him be a real estate mogul or president of America? Oh, because now he has to serve us, the people. No, now he claims extra rights and the right to rule. I mean, if Democrats really believed that we need a government to protect us from the rich and powerful, they'd say, "Oh no, don't impeach Trump. We need Trump in there forever. This way, he's serving us and not in the predatory private sector." It's ridiculous. Molyneux continues, "The first and most obvious problem with this position is that if evil people exist in society, they will also exist within a state. Well, also they'll be more attracted to the state, Kissinger, and be far more dangerous thereby." Zbigniew Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright. "Citizens are able to protect themselves against evil individuals, but stand no chance against an aggressive state armed to the teeth with police and military might, and the belief in the right to rule by the public, who doesn't see it as an invasive tyranny, but as serving the public good, even when mass atrocities are committed." That's why Waco is so important. Average mass shooting is absolutely terrible, and I hate that they happen, but you don't have half the country defending the mass shooters. When Waco happens, you have literally a majority of people defending the murderers, and that's why it's so dangerous. Same thing with foreign policy. Thus, the argument that we need a state because evil people exist is false. If evil people exist, the state must be dismantled, since evil people will be drawn to use its power for their own ends. And unlike private thugs, evil people in government have the police and military to inflict their whims on a helpless and largely disarmed population. Therefore, there are four possibilities as to the mixture of good and evil people in the world. All men are moral. All men are immoral. The majority of men are moral and a minority are immoral. The majority of men are immoral and a minority are moral. A perfect balance of good and evil is statistically impossible. So here are the four options we have in the world. Under none of them is a state justified. When you say all men are moral, therefore a microscopic minority have the right to initiate violence against peaceful people. If you take that standard and apply it to every single one, under no circumstance is the state justified. Molyneux continues, "It is also very hard to understand the logic and intelligence of the argument that in order to protect us from a group that might overpower us, we should support a group that has already overpowered us. It is similar to the statist argument about private monopolies, that citizens should create a state monopoly because they are afraid of private monopoly. Oh, but if monopolies exist, we'll get low quality and a higher price than we otherwise would under free competition, and their corruption might put us at their whim. By the way, you can't resist the state, obviously. They'll murder you if you try to go into Area 51. Revolutions are pointless. You don't need the Second Amendment. You can't overthrow the state anyways. They have a monopoly on taxation. They have a monopoly on legislation. So, of course, I mean, but we already know these things. It's just thinking about the implications of things that we already know to be true. Molyneux then goes on to say, the most efficient thieves argument. He makes these 4 points in a very Austrian economics way. Humans respond to incentives. They are drawn to circumstances under which they can gain the most resources by expanding the least effort. Risk is a great balancer of reward. In general, those interested in stealing property will always gravitate towards situations where the risk of retaliation is lower. This meme really illustrates the point. Types of gangsters, amateurs, people who get together, maybe take a liquor store every now and then. Intermediates, people who say, what is currently illegal and we could engage in a black market? Gambling, drugs, prostitution, alcohol, that's where they go. They have people below them. They have people across the states. You have professionals. This is a group of people that have whole countries in which their gang is allowed to operate and take things by force and commit atrocities without facing repercussions. And then you have absolute God mode, where you control the professionals who create the laws that create the intermediates, who get the amateurs to think that they're really the ones calling the shots. The amateurs are the equivalent of the average voters in the society. We know what's going on. We're really cool. We decide things. The government is us. No, not anymore. Then the average guy who holds up a liquor store is David Rockefeller. Molyneux continues, thus, we can see that the existence of a centralized state creates the following problems with regards to violence. The use of violence tends to increase when the risks of using that violence decrease. If you are going to get shot holding up a bank, you're much less likely to do it. If you have other people do it for you and you don't even have to pay them, And if they get killed, well, then you lose nothing. But if they get the money, you get all the money. Well, of course, in that situation, you're much more likely to engage in the theft. This also applies to a state. Number two, the risk of initiating violence tend to decrease as the disparity of power increases. When I show up to your house with a nuke and the woman is, on life support, you are able to absolutely overtake that person, unfortunately. There is no greater disparity of power than that between a citizen and his government, quite literally, because this other group, it's not just that they have more money or more people or they're more popular. They literally claim the right to rule. When I do something, it is legitimate. When you just have a pen and paper, you just write things down. When I have a pen and paper, it is law. It is legislation that the police enforce, and they're not responsible. They don't make the laws. And I'm not responsible. It's my position. You can't even hold me accountable. That's why there's such a power differential. You don't even know who to blame. Number four, therefore, there is no better way to increase the use of violence than to create a centralized police state. Molyneux then discusses the externalization of costs. When there is a government, however, those who wish to gain the fruits of violence, i.e. tax revenues, the regulation of competitors, the blocking of imports, and so on, can lobby the government to enforce such beneficial restrictions on the free trade and choices of others. So it also gives you an incentive to regulate the behavior of others, because if you don't, they will do so on you. Best example would be if government started determining religion. I shouldn't say that. I should say if government started regulating spirituality. Because if you believe in the wrong religion, then you're just going to kill millions of people. So obviously, they regulate other things. Therefore, they should regulate religious beliefs. If you are a Catholic and a Protestant wins, well, you're screwed. And they're screwed if you win and you get to impose everything on your opposition. That's why, in order to have peace among religions, you need separation of state, separation of violence, and religion. In order to have peace in society, we need separation of state and civilization. That's just the way it is. Thus, in any situation where the cost of using violence can be externalized to some centralized agency, the use of that violence will always tend to increase. How much do you think you would spend if you knew that you would be long dead when the bill came due? Forcibly transferring property from those who have not even been born yet is perhaps the greatest externalization of costs that can be imagined. So the idea of we need government, because if you are a polluter and you sell me and you're polluting to sell me a product which I buy, you and I are engaged in a transaction, but C, a third person has to bear the cost of your pollution. Yeah, externalities definitely exist. How in the world does that justify a state? The Church of Mormon should pretty much run our lives because externalities exist, and therefore they need to regulate them. That also applies to their group. Government is the greatest externalization of cost that can be imagined. That's an excellent line. Has the U.S. military or the police ever externalized costs? Like, does it count as accosting someone when you cage them for a victimless crime, or you take a large percentage of their money, or you steal their house from them, or you cage their parents for truancy laws? Kamala Harris, of course. Excellent economics examples of this are Goldman Sachs was Barack Obama's #1 private contributor. That was in 2009, Michael Moore said that on the Stephen Colbert Show. This is the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez idea that once you win something and it's now the general narrative, you say that doesn't count. There's no center, there's no left wing in this country. That's center right. Yeah, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that's all small government stuff. Department of Education, NASA, all this other stuff, that's small government. What we really want is this. So when Obama wins, Michael Moore automatically jumps on that train and says, yeah, but Obama, that really doesn't count as us winning. So you can't really hold us accountable for the negative stuff because, Goldman Sachs was his #1 private contributor. Well, any moron would see that that's obviously the case. If they had read Anthony Sutton's work, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, if you had read The Creature from Jekyll Island, you would know that what happens is large corporations use the state to stomp out their competition as opposed to competing in a marketplace for customers. So when Obama gets in, no one should be surprised that he implements the Dodd-Frank Act, which closed more credit unions than any other piece in legislative history. So instead of outcompeting them voluntarily in a marketplace, a state exists which you could just outlaw your competition and say, here's the new bar. Only really smart people can get jobs. Well, who does that hurt? The really dumb people. Only the people with the most amount of money and resources can comply with this legislation. Well, obviously that's going to hurt your competitors who are much smaller, like credit unions, and it gives consumers less choice, and it gives you less competition, which stops there from being more price competition, thus increases prices. It gives employees less options of where to work. Under no circumstance is government regulation ever morally justified. Molyneux then says the state is the health of war. Since the taxpayers' money pays for the war, the costs of destruction for those who start the war are very low. How much does George Bush personally pay for the Iraq invasion? Well, it is true that those who profit from war also pay the taxes needed to support the war effort. The amount they pay in taxes is far less than they receive in profits. It's like saying, well, why would anyone want to work for the government? Because, yeah, you'd get money, but then you'd have to pay taxes. Well, the amount that you would receive in benefits exceeds what you would have to bear in cost. That's why a military-industrial complex exists. Again, facts we know because they are always people willing and eager to supply the military. Molyneux continues, in the anarchist view, the state is a fundamental moral evil, not only because it uses violence to achieve its ends, but also because it is the only social agency capable of making war economically advantageous to those with the power to declare it and profit from it. That's why you would see much less war if people and organizations had to directly bear the cost. That's why in order to engage in world wars, we had to leave a gold standard. Molyneux then says there are basically two options that we can choose from when deciding how to live our lives or run a society. So this applies to you in your everyday life and the large-scale philosophical discussions you have with the great minds of the world. Solutions to social problems always fall into two categories, voluntary and coercive, Molyneux says. Molyneux then addresses the problem of the commons. The state itself is subject to the problem of the commons. No one defends and maintains property that cannot be utilized by all. That property is pillaged into oblivion. So, in other words, all of these issues that you say we need to come at them at the with the idea that, oh, there's a problem of the commons, there might be overforestation. Are we going to use a peaceful voluntary method or a coercive method? If it's a coercive method, you better be damn sure you know exactly what to do in exactly what amount, with who, at what time. It's like, yes, I'm going to break into that house because I see a rape occurring. I'm extremely justified. That is a far cry from, I know the state needs to steal trillions or else people will be uneducated. You have no control over what the state is going to do with the money. You have no idea of the people involved. You have no idea of what the outcomes will be, etc. Molyneux then goes into examining the alternatives. Why do most people believe that a coercive monopolistic social agency is required for society to function? He says, in almost all Western democracies, the state chooses where children go to school and how they will be educated and how much you'll fund it. The interest rate citizens can borrow at. That matters because it creates malinvestment, which creates overinvestment, which creates the business cycle and overpricing of things like houses or college tuition. The value of the currency, how employees can be hired and fired, how more than 50% of their citizens' time and money is disposed of. Quickly, one thing about the value of the currency. Imagine if you had 10 anarchist examples of there being hyperinflation and people starving to death. As much as the statist likes to say, well, look, there was little government over here and child labor exists. Well, child labor also exists in countries with big governments because they're too poor. If the kids don't work, they starve to death and die. So that's not uniquely capitalist, but nice try. Imagine if we had seen such currency devaluation when currency was held privately. Or we see the terrible things the Federal Reserve does to the value of the dollar. But it was just done through a voluntary organization. Of course, the example would be, look, bad thing X occurred without the state, therefore the state's legitimate. They never apply their same principles to things that happen because of the state. Who a citizen may choose as a doctor. If you don't have this license, we're going to cage you. What kinds of medical procedures can be received and when? When to go to war? Who can live in the country? So it almost becomes second nature when you're sort of born into this. But if you would explain this to someone in, I don't know, 1912, 1850, 1776, even someone in the 1750s in America living under King George would say King George couldn't possibly control all that stuff. In order to do that, he'd have to trick the populace into voting for one of two morons he controls every year, and they see one of those morons as an extension of themselves. Molyneux then discusses interpersonal crime, saying there's a completely different idea of how states deal with crimes and how any rational organization would deal with crimes. For example, reparations versus charging victims for prison. In other words, A commits an atrocity against B. What A therefore needs to do is repair B, either monetarily or working off the debt or anything to make B whole again. But instead, it's completely flipped on its head. It's, what are you going to do in service of the state? The state will determine it. Well, how come the victim is never asked, what do you want to happen? If anyone has the claim over what should happen to the aggressor, it's the victim. He then goes into the fact that statelessness deals with the worst criminals of all, criminals attracted to power and the crime committed by states. He says it changes the incentives. Police do not benefit at all from protected private property. Whether you are protected or not protected, it's not like there's a mass firing of police. 10 police organizations went out of business because they weren't meeting citizen demand. Of course, that doesn't happen. They know it. That's why the product they produce is such garbage. And they know it. That's why they're so quick to say, I don't choose the laws, I just enforce them. So you're choosing. So if I say, I don't choose to sell crack, I just do it because my boss tells me to. You'll tell me to go on my way? You fucking evil liar. Molyneux says, there is no system that will replace faulty men with perfect angels, but the stateless society, by rewarding goodness and punishing evil, will at least ensure that all devils are visible, instead of cloaking them in the current deadly fog of power, politics, and propaganda. So as bad as it would be if you were hanging out with 50 people, some might engage in theft or battery or something bad. What would be worse is if you took the people that were going to engage in battery, theft, and assault and said, you have the right to rule over the rest of us. Creating a state does not improve the situation morally or economically, which of course is what you expect anytime you have a coercively funded monopoly people can't opt out of. He said, well, look at the way we deal with disputes privately. Theft is dealt with through communication and information sharing, whether it's rating your Uber driver, calling human resources departments, doing the same thing with Lyft. You have Fitch Ratings, Standards & Poor, and Moody's. Now, these are just examples of possible regulatory agencies. They didn't see the crash coming, just like the government didn't see it coming, or the Federal Reserve. It was really only the Ron Pauls, Peter Schiffs, Mises, Hayeks, and Rothbards of the world who understood the Austrian business cycle theory. Credit ratings, seller ratings, you could have things like Good Housekeeping magazine or customer inspection agencies. People have ratings on Amazon's as sellers. People have ratings on eBay as sellers as well. Anything voluntary, let's welcome it. Irrational laws, that's another thing people say. Well, what if we don't have a state and someone just makes a crazy irrational law like, if one person steps 1 micrometer on my property, I get to drop a nuclear bomb on the city they live in. Okay, the existence of a state doesn't stop that from happening, but since we're playing this game, first of all, no real solution exists in a state of society. Second, there's an enormous difference between a reactive and a proactive legal solution. So a reactive legal system says when crime is committed, we'll then react to it. And then we'll respond to it, then we'll punish the evildoers. A proactive one says, what might happen, let's weigh the costs and benefits to the peaceful people of how we can avoid this from happening in the first place. That gets us back to the security systems, private gun ownership, private taser ownership, pepper spray, just shaming people who believe in certain crimes being legitimate definitely plays a big role. Molyneux continues, how much would others pay to violate the rights of others if they had to bear the cost? In other words, what is the likelihood that Dennis Prager and his pals would voluntarily chip in to support the drug war? So even if we're not even talking about morality, we're only talking about the economics of a stateless society. How much would people bear to protect their own house? Probably quite a bit. How much would they pay in order to stop someone from using Adderall without a prescription? I say Adderall instead of meth because people only use meth because in the same way they really only drank moonshine during Prohibition. You wouldn't be having things like meth and heroin and black tar, crocodile, or whatever there is. You'd have a much more healthy, wide range of choices that would allow you to use drugs much safer in the absence of drug prohibition. He goes on to say that we need to look at all the number of laws. How many have you read? And have you ever gone to another state in America without reading the laws? Have you ever gone to another country without reading the laws? Are you able to cooperate with other people without reading all the laws and the history of their legislative traditions and judicial opinions? Well, of course, here's an article. How many federal laws are there again? There are at least 5,000 federal criminal laws. So the idea that, well, without government, private groups might do undesirable things. Is it desirable to have 5,000 federal criminal laws? They could cage you for anything you want. With 10,000 to 300,000 regulations that can be enforced criminally. In fact, our entire criminal code has become a leviathan unto itself. In 2003, there were only 4,000 offenses that carried criminal penalties. By 2013, that number had grown to 21%. By 21% to 4,850. So the idea of, well, what if there's a private dispute resolution security organization and they just don't tell you what the laws are and they don't care to educate you and they just start enforcing arbitrary edicts? Already happens with a state and is less likely to happen when you can opt out of funding organizations. Molyneux continues, anarchists recognize that power corrupts, while statists forever believe that power is the cure for corruption. Just got to get the right people in the state. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the state. If we just get Trump in there or we just get Bernie in there, then absolutely. Then there won't be corruption because we'll have a solution to it. Anarchists understand that the only valid and proven way to oppose human corruption is through voluntarism and competition. Statists believe that the only way to oppose human corruption is to create a monopoly of violent power and then get millions of strangers educated by the state to elect people. This is what Thomas Sowell referred to as a conflict of visions, ideological origins of political struggle. The constrained vision being that human nature is fundamentally flawed. We don't have enough information for things. Therefore, we have to focus on procedural ways to achieve at socially desirable ends after weighing the trade-offs, costs, and benefits. The unconstrained vision says humans are capable of anything. All we need to do is the right amount of studying, research, and argumentation, and then the right people will have power, and then they'll make the right laws and get the right people to enforce them the right way. Molyneux continues saying, the anarchist solution. Another great thing from Thomas Sowell, you learn that there's only trade-offs, no such thing as a solution. Molyneux says, imagine if I suggested the following as a solution to the problem of how to deliver healthcare in a stateless society. The way that I see it working is this. One dispute resolution organization should amass enough weaponry to violently drive all other medical DROs out of business. This DRO should then take about 20% of people's income and kidnap or shoot them if they do not give up their money, and then provide health care as it sees fit. This same DRO should have complete control over how many doctors there are, and how a doctor should be trained, and how a doctor should be paid. Again, if anyone attempts to become a doctor without following the detailed and lengthy rules of this DRO, they can be kidnapped or shot. The DRO should pay doctors per patient visit to ensure that doctors should see as many patients as possible in any given day, and it should make sure that doctors are neither paid for successful treatments nor penalized for any unsuccessful treatments. Doctors should not make any money whatsoever by preventing illness, but rather should get paid for treating as many illnesses as possible, as quickly as possible. Furthermore, this DRO monopoly should be able to shoot or kidnap anyone who dares to collect and publicize any information about the success rate of its doctors. In order to ensure that citizen feedback is available to this DRO, every couple of years, citizens should be able to appoint a representative of their choice to the board of directors. Whoever they choose should be paid by the existing doctors that the DRO controls or by the pharmaceutical companies. In other words, this is a long-winded way of saying, literally explain to the statist what the status quo is of how the state operates, apply it to non-state actors, and then they will see how ridiculous it is. He says, customers must be the consumers. In other words, imagine an automobile manufacturer that was paid by politicians rather than people who buy cars. What if they were paid by quantity of cars and not the quality of cars, or the longevity, or the amount of Bluetooth or stereo options or seat comfort that people value and voluntarily pay more, or electronic windows? What if government had a universal cell phone plan in 1980? This is actually a question that Ron Paul asks. In other words, if you want widespread distribution and innovation, don't give the state a monopoly. As Paul Krugman mentions in his book, The Conscience of a Liberal, page 224. Paul Krugman says, in 2004, government programs paid for 40% of healthcare in America. That is in 2004, before Bush's Medicare Part D, before Obamacare. While private insurance paid for only 36%, most of the rest was out-of-pocket spending, which exists everywhere. So, in other words, the idea that, well, there was a real laissez-faire market, and then Obama wanted to do one little thing, but then the racists just said, no, we're too racist. That, of course, is the story that they try to peddle. But the reality is, the state constantly involves its things, decreases innovation, increases price, lowers competition, decreases the likelihood consumers can get what they want. We get a bad product, and then the state uses it as a further justification for how bad things are. Only Gordon Gekko can afford a phone quick. The state needs to monopolize phone production and guarantee a phone to everyone. Well, government causes shortages, so that actually wouldn't do anything. Here is a source on George Bush trying to get everyone in America to own a home. What happens? You end up overinflating the housing market, creating a bubble, creating the business cycle through Fannie and Freddie. They're doing the same thing with Sallie Mae and college loans. Everyone deserves health care. They get involved, healthcare price increases. Everyone deserves education. Cost of college tuition drastically increases. We want everyone to get a house. Creates the housing bubble. Happens in every sector. So that's why healthcare is so expensive in America. The balancing act, Molyneux says. He says, we want to help the unfortunate and vulnerable, but do not want to subsidize bad decisions or waste money and give it to bad actors. He says this is why charity and pro bono work are such important aspects of society. You can go to givewell.org. That is one way where people can give money to help organizations and people that are in need. It was recommended to me by Jason Brennan, a philosopher, and Michael Huemer mentions it in his book as well. But you want to make sure you're not funding people's drug addicts because you might literally be killing them. I know a drug addict who once said, thank God I was poor or I'd be dead. Because if he had so much more money, then he would have used so many more drugs that would have killed him at a much earlier age. This balancing act constantly exists everywhere in society, whether it's Blockbuster or Sears. We don't want to fund an inefficient amount of resources being funneled to one place, because every dime we spend one place is a dime that isn't spent elsewhere. Every store that exists that is a Sears is not a Fry's supermarket, or every Sam Goody that exists is not an Apple store or a Best Buy that gives people more of what they want. This is why you need the cleansing mechanism of people going out of business and doing other things. At the current rate of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, public schooling, no matter what, they're just always going to exist and constantly be taking up resources, regardless of their inefficiency or corruption. Molyneux continues, once more, this possibility of corruption and or error is often considered to be an airtight argument against anarchy, when in fact it is an airtight argument for anarchy and against statism. They'll often try and get you with these truisms. The world is complex, therefore we need a state. Look, things are complicated. That's why you can't have freedom. We need legislatures and branches and all this and that. When you could just say, yeah, the world is complicated, therefore we can't have a government controlling everything. The world is complicated. We can't have one group monopolizing legislation and stealing trillions every year. That's what John Bolton said to Tucker Carlson. He goes, look, Tucker, the world is complex and you don't get that. So instead of actually addressing your arguments, I'm just going to tell you things are complex instead of actually justifying my previous decisions. And Tucker says, I'm the one who understands it's complex and we can't just intervene in a place and turn it into a Jeffersonian democracy. Not that that would be desirable, but you get the logic of the argument. Molyneux says competition and voluntarism are the only known methodologies for repairing and opposing the inevitable errors and corruption that constantly creep into human relations. The fact that human beings can make mistakes and are always susceptible to corruption is exactly why they should never be given a monopoly power of violence over others. This again is discussed in A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. Definitely a methodology of thinking that I would recommend. The book is too long and actually not worth reading the entire thing. Molyneux then discusses prisons. Will prisons exist? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that is the best solution. I don't know. Not going to be king of anarchy. What this engages in is the fallacy of unattainable perfection. In other words, what if there's bad guys and we don't catch them? Or what if there's good guys and they go to prison? Yeah, that could happen in a voluntary society. You know, it could also happen with a statist society. When Bush and Rockefeller are calling the shots with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Kissinger, and they're part of a country that just openly runs the world through the United Nations. Not runs, but calls the shots internationally, and everyone else sees as the leader of the free world. The leader of the free world is these mass murdering psychopaths. That is what statism results in. No, without government, bad people might have power. Molyneux says, if there are a lot of evil people, we cannot have a state, and if there are a few evil people, then we don't need a state. Dispute resolution organizations will band together to deny the advantages of modern economic life to those individuals who egregiously harm their fellow citizens. Robert Murphy, in his book Chaos Theory, says, well, it's not like every shop owner is going to know every person and be able to say, you're a serial killer, you're okay. Well, there's just too many people to interact with, and we have no way of determining that. So instead, what you would have is insurance agencies insuring people that if you ever commit a crime, well, then we'll pay on your behalf. These insurance companies will then incentivize good behavior. There will be competition. I don't know what the solution is. Neither do they, but these are just ideas of alternative possibilities, just like money. What Molyneux says is it's important to not get caught up in, I know exactly how money's going to work in 100 years when people I've never met are talking about technologies that don't exist yet. It's almost a futile discussion. What we should focus on is, what do I want as a consumer? Because if you have a market economy, the greatest incentive is to make something that consumers demand. This way you can appeal to the widest range of possible people to trade with and get money from. He says money should be designed to facilitate communication in a many-to-many scenario. Here are some examples of private money. Bitcoin, when you have chips at a casino, a lot of private money could be used in credit cards. When you pay interest on things, that counts as private money. When banks lend out more than they have, fractional reserve, of course, is a different discussion. You had something called the Liberty Dollar, which the state saw as a threat to its monopoly, outlawed it, and caged the person for doing it. Money reflects the degree of actionable demand for goods and services, Molyneux says. He says, of course, it is entirely natural and inevitable that the government defines its own actions as virtuous and the exact same actions as evil and criminal if performed by others. He says, here's how you should approach something like money, or how roads would work, or how jails would work, or how education would work when talking to a statist. He says, describe how you think an anarchist society should be run, but smuggle some statist principles in just to see if people notice the substitution. So he says, here's an example. The way I see currency working in a stateless society is that one particular private agency should have the right to print as much money as it wants, whenever it wants, and it should use this power to pay for an army that it would then use to shoot anyone who tried printing competing currencies, like the Liberty Dollar. This agency should have the right to create debts for people who have not been born yet, and to charge whatever it wants to the citizenry as a whole, using the future income that will steal from them as collateral for spending it in the here and now. So you just described the logic of their own, of the system that they advocate right back to them under different circumstances, and they see exactly right through it. Again, we get into psychic anarchists. It is impossible to know for certain what the future will hold. But the printing press is just being created. Only the elites are going to have books. Therefore, we need the government to create a monopoly on books and then distribute them. Why? What's going to take its place? Well, you're not going to know that Amazon is going to eventually be created by a guy named Jeff Bezos and be the #1 book producer. You're not going to know about half-price books or Barnes & Noble or any, you're not going to know about PDFs or anything like that. So again, just playing the technicality game is just such a waste of time. And it plays right into their hands because they don't know the future either. Tell me exactly who's going to be in political office 10 years from now. What are the laws going to be? How are the laws going to be enforced? What opinions will the judges hold about how to interpret the laws? Because even the most obvious ones, this, you have a freedom of speech, First and Second Amendment, right to bear arms. People don't know what those means, and they're pretty clear cut. So the idea that, well, we need clarity and assurance, therefore we need a government, that doesn't give you either of those things. So what Molyneux says, look, all I can tell you is what I would prefer as a customer. Entrepreneurs in a free market tend to focus on customer demand. That's why we should talk about what we want as consumers to incentivize entrepreneurs and give them ideas. Inconvenience breeds entrepreneurship. That's why shows like Shark Tank are so great. People like Sam Walton create great things like Walmart, Bill Gates creating Microsoft. And great examples are people like Walmart, Amazon, and Microsoft being excellent companies that absolutely get co-opted with their relation to the state. Walmart advocating higher minimum wage laws, hurting people with the least amount of skills, stopping them from getting their foot in the door. Bezos, total CIA corrupt jerk, now controlling the Washington Post, has, I think, a $600 million contract with the Pentagon, according to the movie Hoaxed by Mike Cernovich. Bill Gates, well, he's just so obviously with his TED Talks on population control. So this is another example of how these people who aren't necessarily good have to do good things in a market economy in order to become rich by meeting consumer demand. Mark Cuban on Shark Tank, another example, Mr. Wonderful on Shark Tank, total jerk in real life, but has made billions of total strangers happy because of products that he has created. Molyneux then discusses saving the children. Oh, I really care about the children. This is why we need the state to exist and control education and control all the guns in society. Well, first of all, take the logic, apply it to the state. Government doesn't necessarily keep the children safe. In fact, they're often mass murderers of children, not to mention Planned Parenthood. Molyneux says, all moralists interested in improving society must answer the most essential questions about human motivation and show how their proposed solutions will create a rational framework of incentives, punishments, and rewards that further moral goals generally accepted as good. Again, the existence of a state does not automatically protect children. In fact, it most it most often violates the rights that they have. Before discussing how a stateless society can far better produce whatever, protect the children in this example, let us first look at how existing societies create problems for children, the Department of Education and the child abuse that goes on there, the amount of time that they waste from children, the amount of bullying that goes on, time spent away from parents that would be built that would be spent building relationships with family members and becoming much more close, creating insecurities in kids. You didn't get an A on this paper. Well, it's all mind control nonsense written by known liars. Good. I shouldn't get an A. That just means I'm conforming to psychopathy. Or just take the fact that inflation exists. Whenever kids try and get a job and save money, you have the state spending on their behalf, saying, we are going to make you pay for things you do not consent to. Just imagine if Ford did that. We're going to buy cars and charge complete strangers for them. It's bad enough. People see it as exploitation when you voluntarily engage in a contract. What about forcibly contracting people who you don't even know? That's what the state does on a daily basis. And then, of course, the truancy hotline. If you catch parents not sending their kids to cult indoctrination centers, call us. We'll cage the parents. That hurts the children. Again, automatically creating a group of people monopolizing violence does not stop something from existing, such as violating the rights of children or keeping them safe. Molyneux then discusses the future. Towards the end of the book, he says, the story of the progress of human morals is almost entirely populated by people who did not live to see the world that they loved in their minds. Those to whom the idea of the separation of church and state arose as a tiny, faint glimmer over the burning horizon of religious warfare did not live to see these two whores pried apart by the power of philosophy. Those who first dreamed of a world free of slavery live not only to see slavery increase and worsen, not diminish and collapse. Those who dreamed of reason, evidence, and science in the late Middle Ages saw their dreams go up in endless flames, and all too often themselves as well, under the burning mercies of Christian salvation. Under the burning mercies of Christian salvation. So people such as Frederick Douglass, Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Franklin, it's too often you get caught up in the idea of what matters right now. I mean, look, we're faced with Pete Buttigieg and Donald Trump. Tell me your temporary opinion on politicians that exist right now in this society. Well, no, let's talk about bigger concepts. There's a great quote. Small minds talk about people, big minds talk about ideas. That's what's really important in life. He finishes by just giving a message to the individual reader. He says, if someone can't get it from you voluntarily, then they don't deserve it, whether it's a parent or a boss or a friend or a group of people called the Congress group. Any group of people, if they can't get something for you voluntarily, they don't deserve it. We know this in our everyday life. Apply it to the state. You'll see it as illegitimate, and you'll embrace Practical Anarchy, the Freedom of the Future by Stefan Molyneux. Book summary, part 2. Thank you for watching. Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone.